In the suffocating darkness of November 14th, 1942, at 2300 hours, a revolution was quietly unfolding. Aboard the USS Washington, operators stared at glowing screens as 9 Japanese warships, 18,000 yards distant, materialized from the void. North of Guadalcanal, the enemy fleet sailed completely blind, invisible to the human eye, yet every vessel was rendered as a distinct green blip on the Washington's SG radar, their positions relentlessly updated with each antenna sweep. While the Japanese strained their eyes through binoculars and readied their searchlights, they remained utterly oblivious. An American battleship was watching their every move. For 16 agonizing months, Washington's crew had drilled with this game-changing technology. Its SG surface search radar could pierce the horizon, detecting ships at ranges that defied belief. Its Mark III fire control radar could lock onto a target and compute a firing solution in total blackness. These systems combined to grant the Washington an almost supernatural ability to fight blind, to destroy what it could not see. Yet in November 1942, this power was dismissed. Within the Pacific Fleet, a dangerous consensus held that no battleship could possibly win a modern naval fight. It was an assumption that was about to be paid for in blood. Admirals dismissed them as mere screening vessels, just floating anti-aircraft platforms. Costly escorts diminished to the role of oversized destroyers guarding carriers. The official doctrine was chillingly clear. Battleships were obsolete, their purpose reduced to throwing up flak while the carriers fought the real war. Ever since Pearl Harbor, the fast battleships were held on a tight leash, explicitly forbidden from seeking surface combat and shackled to defensive duties. The Washington had traversed the Atlantic, served alongside the British home fleet, and transferred to the vast Pacific. Yet in all that time, her formidable main battery had never once tasted battle against an enemy warship. Tonight, that would change. Tonight, one ship and one admiral would demonstrate that battleships, when properly employed with the right technology, could still dominate the seas. But first, the 3,700 Americans aboard Washington would have to endure what was about to escalate into the most violent surface engagement of the Pacific War. The battleship itself was not the issue. Washington was a marvel of American engineering, the second vessel of the North Carolina class, laid down at the Philadelphia Navy Yard on June 14, 1938. She displaced 35,000 tons standard, swelling to 44,800 tons fully loaded. Her main armament consisted of 9 16-inch Mark VI guns in 3 triple turrets, capable of launching 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells over 20 miles. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, her turret faces 18 inches. 4 General Electric turbines churned out 121,000 shaft horsepower, propelling her at a blistering 28 knots. She could fight, she could run, and she could absorb terrifying punishment. But in the twisted logic of 1942 naval doctrine, she was deemed too valuable to risk in the very combat she was built for. Just 3 nights earlier, the price of that doctrine had been paid in blood. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan had guided Task Force 67 into these same dark waters to intercept a Japanese bombardment force. His fleet included the heavy cruisers San Francisco and Portland, the light cruiser Helena, the anti-aircraft cruisers Juno and Atlanta, and 8 destroyers. It should have been a formidable force, yet Callahan had no battleships. The Navy possessed exactly 2 operational battleships in the entire South Pacific, Washington and South Dakota. Both were being held back to guard the carrier Enterprise, the last functional American carrier in the Pacific. Doctrine dictated that carriers were too precious to risk, and battleships existed only to protect them, so Callahan went in without his heavy hitters. The result was a catastrophe. In a chaotic night action later dubbed the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Callahan's force blundered directly into Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment group. The Japanese brought 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, the heavy cruiser Kinugasa, 2 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers. What ensued was not a battle. It was a barroom brawl with naval guns. Ships blasted away at point-blank range, unable to separate friend from foe. American ships fired on each other. Japanese searchlights sliced the night into a nightmare of blinding glare and deep shadow. When the smoke cleared, Callahan was dead on the bridge of the San Francisco, obliterated by a direct hit from a 14-inch shell. Rear Admiral Norman Scott was dead aboard the Atlanta, a victim of friendly fire in the confusion. The destroyers Barton, Cushing, Laffey, and Monson were sinking or sunk. The Atlanta was dying. The Juno would be torpedoed and lost with nearly all her crew while attempting to withdraw. 706 Americans were dead. The Japanese, in contrast, had lost only 2 destroyers, Akatsuki and Udachi, though the battleship Hiei was crippled and would be finished off by air attack the next day. At his Pearl Harbor headquarters, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the after-action reports with mounting dread. The Marines on Guadalcanal were barely hanging on. Henderson Field, the vital airstrip that made the island worth dying for, was suffering nightly bombardment. Now intelligence warned of an even larger Japanese force steaming south. Admiral Nobutake Kondo was coming with the battleship Kirishima, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Their objective, pound Henderson Field into rubble and cover the landing of 11,000 fresh Japanese troops. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall, the Marines would be overrun, and the first American offensive of the war would collapse in disaster. Nimitz was trapped. Doctrine screamed, "Never risk battleships without carrier support." But the Enterprise was damaged, operating with a patched flight deck from the Battle of Santa Cruz 3 weeks prior, her air group depleted. If Nimitz held the battleships back to screen the carrier, Henderson Field was doomed, Guadalcanal would be lost, and months of sacrifice would be for nothing. If he sent the battleships in alone, they might all be sunk, leaving Enterprise defenseless. Every lesson from the Naval War College, every war game he had ever run, insisted that battleships operating alone at night were doomed. But the Marines were out of time. Nimitz made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered Admiral William Halsey to release the battleships. Send them in. Let them fight ship to ship. Doctrine be damned. The man selected for this desperate charge was Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr. At 54, Lee was an unlikely warrior. Born in Natley, Kentucky, he had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1908. Short, stocky, and perpetually disheveled, Lee looked more like a rural schoolteacher than an admiral. His uniforms never fit. He wore thick glasses and spoke with a Kentucky drawl that caused others to underestimate him. But hidden behind that unremarkable facade was one of the most brilliant tactical minds in the U.S. Navy. Lee was a marksman without equal. At the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, he won 5 gold, 2 silver, and 1 bronze medal in shooting. He could put 10 shots through the same hole at 1,000 yards. He understood ballistics intuitively, perfectly. Trajectories, windage, bullet drop. They weren't calculations to him, they were instincts. When he transitioned from rifles to 16-inch naval guns, that intuition came with him. He saw the principles as the same, just a difference in scale. But Lee understood something far more important than gunnery. He understood radar in a way few admirals of 1942 did. While his peers saw it as a novelty, a supplement to visual spotting, Lee recognized it as a complete revolution. A ship with radar could see through darkness, smoke, and rain. It could track targets at impossible ranges and calculate firing solutions with mathematical precision. It could allow one ship to dominate an enemy fighting blind. For 6 months, Lee had drilled his crews relentlessly in radar-directed gunnery, redesigning Washington's fire control procedures from the ground up. He bypassed the standard Navy system of talkers relaying information, wiring the radar operators directly to the gunnery officer. The radar plot could designate targets in real time, and the fire control radar could track the fall of shot to correct aim between salvos. It was a system never tested in combat, perfected only through hundreds of hours of drilling. Now, Lee would find out if it worked. His command, Task Force 64, consisted of his flagship Washington, the battleship South Dakota, and 4 destroyers, Walker, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. On paper, it was impressive. In reality, it was a scratch team that had never operated together. South Dakota had just arrived after repairs from the Battle of Santa Cruz, her crew, green. The destroyers were pulled from different groups. There had been no time for exercises. Lee had 1 day to forge them into a cohesive force. The problems ran deeper. Washington and South Dakota had incompatible radio systems, operating on different frequencies. Lee discovered this only after they were at sea, forcing him to jury-rig a communication plan using signal lights. The destroyers, armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes, were designed for close-range knife fights, completely outgunned by the approaching Japanese fleet. Their torpedoes were their only advantage, but using them meant closing to within 10,000 yards, well inside the enemy's kill zone. As the sun set on November 14th, Lee led his small force into Ironbottom Sound, waters already littered with the wrecks of dozens of American ships. Rounding Savo Island, his men could see the oil slicks and floating bodies from Callahan's battle. Lee knew exactly what he was facing. Kondo was bringing the veteran battleship Kirishima, the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, the light cruisers Sendai and Nagara, and 9 destroyers, 14 ships total, all trained for night fighting, and all armed with the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the deadliest in the world, capable of running 12 miles with a 1,000-pound warhead. The Japanese had trained for night combat for 2 decades. Their lookouts had superhuman night vision. Their star shells and searchlights were weapons in themselves. They had proven their superiority time and again. American sailors had learned to fear the dark. The night belonged to the Japanese. But Lee had radar. As Task Force 64 slipped through the Sound, Washington's radar tracked every contact. They saw the mountains, friendly aircraft, and at 22:52, the first enemy ships, destroyers sweeping ahead, 18,000 yards and closing. Lee faced a critical choice: open fire at maximum range, revealing his position, or wait, letting the Japanese commit to their bombardment run and spring the ambush. It was a terrible risk. If the Japanese spotted him first and launched torpedoes, the task force would be annihilated. But Lee gambled on Japanese overconfidence. They were expecting PT boats and aircraft, not battleships. He ordered his ships to hold fire. The range closed. 16,000 yards, 14,000, 12,000. On Washington's bridge, men could hear their own hearts pounding. 10,000 yards. The Japanese, focused on Guadalcanal, still hadn't seen them. 8,000 yards. Lee could wait no more. At 2300 hours, he gave the order. Washington's first salvo erupted. 9 16-inch shells, 24,300 pounds of steel, screamed toward the light cruiser Sendai, aimed at a target the gunners could not see. The shells missed, but the resulting water columns drenched the Sendai's decks. Her captain, stunned, ordered evasive action. But Sendai was a distraction. Washington's radar had locked on the destroyer Ayanami, the most immediate threat. The second salvo shifted. This time, it did not miss. At least one 16-inch shell vaporized the Ayanami, detonating in her engine room and blowing her apart. She went dead in the water, a burning wreck. The night exploded into chaos. South Dakota and the American destroyers opened fire. Japanese star shells burst overhead, bathing the Sound in eerie light. Searchlights snapped on, tracers crisscrossed the water. It was Callahan's battle all over again, except for radar. Then, disaster. At 2307, the South Dakota suffered a catastrophic electrical failure. A chief engineer trying to fix a minor issue accidentally threw the main circuit breakers. The entire ship died. Radar, gun directors, ammunition hoists, all black. In seconds, the battleship was a blind, floating target. The Japanese pounced. Searchlights from Kirishima and the cruisers locked onto the South Dakota. Every Japanese gun opened up. In 90 seconds, she took 27 hits. 14-inch shells from Kirishima and 8-inch shells from the cruisers tore through her superstructure. Her radar and radios were destroyed. 38 sailors were killed and 59 wounded. The American destroyers fared even worse. Charging in to launch torpedoes, they were met by overwhelming firepower. The Preston died first, caught in a crossfire, her magazines detonating in a ball of fire, taking 117 men with her. The Walker, leading the column, was hit by shells, and then a long-lance torpedo, breaking in half and sinking in minutes with 175 of her crew. The Benham had her bow blown completely off by a torpedo, but miraculously stayed afloat. The Gwyn, burning from multiple hits, was forced to withdraw. In less than 15 minutes, Lee's destroyer screen was gone. By 2315, Task Force 64 had ceased to exist. 4 destroyers were sunk or crippled. The South Dakota was blind, deaf, and limping away. Only the Washington remained, alone, facing 14 enemy ships. Every tactical manual demanded withdrawal. But Willis Lee looked at his radar screen. In their frenzy to pound the South Dakota, the Japanese had broken formation, and crucially, none of them had noticed the Washington, hidden behind the burning wrecks. Lee gave the order that would define naval history. Radio silence, no lights, maximum speed. Washington accelerated to 26 knots, charging directly into the enemy fleet. Her radar operators whispered the ranges. 15,000 yards to Kirishima, 12,000, 10,000. The Japanese searchlights were still fixed on the retreating South Dakota. At 8,400 yards, point-blank range, Lee gave the order. Washington's entire main battery spoke at once. With radar fire control and a stationary illuminated target, the gunners could not miss. The first salvo straddled. The second was a direct hit. Then another and another. In 7 minutes, Washington fired 75 16-inch shells. At least 9, possibly 20, slammed into the Kirishima. The 2,700-pound shells hit with the force of freight trains, punching through her armor like paper. One shell destroyed a forward turret. Another detonated in an engine room. A third hit below the waterline, flooding 3 compartments. Her steering gear was smashed, jamming her rudder. She began to circle helplessly as Washington's 5-inch secondary battery joined the assault, raking her superstructure with over 100 shells, setting her ablaze from stem to stern. Admiral Kondo, watching his flagship burn, realized he had been ambushed. His cruisers, Otago and Takao, finally turned their searchlights on Washington, opening fire and launching 16 torpedoes. But Washington was already turning, her radar tracking the incoming torpedoes. Lee ordered a hard turn, and the battleship raced north as every torpedo missed, some by mere yards. The Japanese cruisers tried to pursue, but Lee was repositioning, using his speed and radar to control the fight. As the range opened, Washington's guns shifted to the cruisers, straddling the Otago. Admiral Kondo, now the hunted, ordered an immediate withdrawal, fleeing into the night. Behind them, the Kirishima was dying. At 1 o'clock on November 15th, her captain ordered the ship abandoned. At 3:20, she rolled over and sank, the first battleship sunk by another battleship in the Pacific War, destroyed by a single ship fighting alone. Lee wanted to pursue, but American PT boats, unable to distinguish friend from foe, were preparing to attack anything that moved. Lee broke radio silence with a characteristic message. "This is Ching Lee. Get out of my way. I'm coming through." As dawn broke, the scale of the victory became clear. The Japanese troop transports, now exposed, were swarmed by aircraft from Henderson Field. 7 were sunk. The final Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal had failed. The cost was terrible. 3 destroyers lost, over 400 killed. But they had stopped the Japanese cold. Kirishima was at the bottom of the Sound. The Japanese would never again send capital ships to Guadalcanal. One statistic from the battle was almost unbelievable. The USS Washington, which had single-handedly defeated an enemy battleship and driven off a fleet, suffered no casualties. Not one man was killed or seriously wounded. The ship itself had taken only one 5-inch hit that cut a radio antenna. In the most violent surface battle of the campaign, the ship that dealt the most damage had taken the least. It was unprecedented. Admiral Halsey sent Lee a message. "You and your task force have written a glorious page in American naval history." But the official response was muted. The battle was classified as defensive. Lee's report, emphasizing the revolutionary power of radar, was filed away. The carrier admirals didn't want to admit battleships still had offensive value, and the battleship admirals didn't want to admit the carrier advocates had been wrong about their obsolescence. Washington's victory was treated as an anomaly. Lee, philosophical, was privately frustrated, writing detailed reports on radar tactics that were mostly ignored. The Japanese Navy was confused, initially claiming cruisers had sunk Kirishima, unable to believe a single battleship had routed them. When the truth was confirmed, the psychological impact was profound. The night was no longer safe. Their advantage was gone, neutralized by American radar. Washington would go on to fight across the Pacific, earning 13 battle stars. But she would never again engage an enemy warship. She was tied to the carriers, her 16-inch guns reduced to shore bombardment. The tragedy was not her escort duty, but that the lessons of her victory were deliberately ignored. Lee had proved that radar-equipped battleships could dominate night combat, but the bureaucracy, committed to the carrier, refused to see it. Lee was promoted to vice admiral, but his battleships remained on a leash. He watched with frustration as opportunities were missed at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, knowing what his ships could do if unleashed. On August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan surrendered, Willis Augustus Lee Jr. died suddenly of a heart attack. He was 57. The man who had revolutionized battleship warfare and saved Guadalcanal died just as the war ended. His obituaries mentioned his Olympic medals, but gave only a single sentence to his defining battle. Washington was decommissioned in 1947. On May 24, 1961, she was sold for scrap. No effort was made to preserve her. The battleship that saved Guadalcanal was reduced to razor blades. Today, Washington's achievement remains largely unknown, but her legacy lives on. The Aegis combat system on modern warships is a direct descendant of the radar fire control Lee pioneered. The principles he developed, engaging beyond visual range, using technology to overcome numbers, are the foundation of modern naval combat. The bitter irony is that Lee was right. Lives could have been saved, battles won more decisively, but institutional inertia prevented the Navy from learning. This pattern persists. Revolutionary advantages are often discovered by operators in desperate circumstances, only to be resisted by the establishment. As new challenges arise, the lesson of the Washington remains. The service that adapts fastest, that values results over doctrine, will dominate. There is one final piece to the Washington story. Throughout her entire combat career, through 13 major engagements, she never lost a single crew member to enemy action, not one. It was not luck. It was the result of superb training and the revolutionary tactics Lee had developed, striking from the darkness where the enemy was blind. The physical traces of the Washington are long gone, her steel melted and repurposed, her brave crew almost all passed into time. But their achievement endures, etched into the very principles they proved. That technology, when masterfully employed, multiplies combat power. That training and tactics will always matter more than raw numbers, and that a single ship, under the right commander with the right tools, can indeed defy a fleet. These are not just lessons for naval warfare. They are lessons for any arena where innovation confronts orthodoxy. As we reflect on that night off Guadalcanal, we remember not just the events, but their meaning. A battleship written off by doctrine, commanded by an admiral who defied appearances, and wielding technology few understood, saved the first American offensive of the Pacific War. Her victory was then minimized, a footnote created because it challenged the dominant narrative. The ship that proved battleships could still win was allowed to be forgotten, because remembering her meant admitting the experts had been wrong. This is the story of the battleship that saved Guadalcanal, proved innovation could overcome tradition, and was obscured for achieving the impossible. These stories matter, not merely because they are history, but because they are truth. And that truth, like the men who fought in the darkness, demands to be remembered.